I'm now going to hand over to Daniel Haslam, who's going to introduce and chair a session with Brigid Carroll, one of my mentors and heroes in leadership studies. So over to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Owain. Yeah, it was really great to see everyone involved in asking questions. Big thanks to Grace as well. And yes, as Owain said, I'm going to take over chairing duties while he has a well-deserved rest, I think. Yeah, firstly, my name is Daniel Haslam. I'm a lecturer at the Open University, and I'm a member of the Centre for Voluntary Sector Leadership, where obviously, as the title suggests, we do a lot of research that looks at the voluntary sector and cross-cuts a lot of the issues that we were just talking about social movements, etc. I'm really delighted to introduce Professor Brigid Carroll, who is our second speaker. Bridget holds the Fletcher Building Employee Education Fund Chair in Leadership at the University of Auckland. And she's recognised as one of the leading scholars on developing leadership, and in particular has provided some really great insight into how power and identity work in practices of leadership. Related to that, her work's been instrumental in developing a practice understanding of leadership more generally, and she teaches broadly in the area of leadership, organisational theory and qualitative research methods at undergraduate, postgraduate and executive level, and that's across sectoral boundaries, including development work with corporate, community, professional and youth organisations. So a lot going on there. Brigid is also the author of a wide range of highly cited work in journals such as Organisation Studies, Human Relations, Management Learning and Leadership itself, and is the co-editor of the books Leadership, Contemporary Critical Perspectives, Responsible Leadership, Romanticism and Realism, and After Leadership. And the topic for Brigid's talk today is Rebooting, Hope, Resetting Leadership. And we're very much looking forward to hearing it. So over to you, Professor Carroll.
Hello, it's lovely to think of you behind the screen. I can't see you, but you are my community, and I haven't been able to leave our country for the last 2 years. So I do miss you. It's early in the morning in New Zealand. I have a house of 3 sleeping young men, my sons who probably won't disturb us, and 2 dogs who might, but we will be fine. I'm really privileged to come after Grace and to build on her amazing knowledge and communication. She's done a big macro look. I'm going to do a deep dive. I'm going to go do a deep dive into a pool of water that I think has sustained leadership in ways that are too simple, and we are going to complicate that pool. I am going to use slides. I'm very aware my New Zealand twang often needs a bit of help, and I am going to be leaving the stats and so on to Grace. I'm going to be doing metaphor, story, and some ideas. So we want to look at hope, and then we're going to start in classical Greece. You know the story, but I'll tell it, and there are different versions of it. But Pandora is the first woman in classical Greece mythology. Zeus is in a real tantrum. Prometheus has stolen his fire, and he wants to punish men. How does he do that? He creates the first woman, not as a gift, but as a form of punishment. He asks the other goddesses in particular to give her gifts, and Pandora actually means all gifted. So they give her grace, they give her beauty, they give her cunning, they give her guile, they give her curiosity. They give her a whole lot of things that are essentially designed to bug men, and probably do. And then he sends her off to Prometheus's brother, Epimetheus, and promises her in marriage. And he gives her a jar, which later turns into the box in the 16th century, and says just not to open it. So that's her dowry. So off she goes to marry her new husband with a jar she can't open. What could go wrong? Brigid,
sorry, I'm just going to interrupt because I can't see your slide, so I'm wondering if anyone else can.
Oh, damn. Hang on, I'll escape. And I'll check. That's a good trick. They're beautiful slides. Let me try again. And tell me if you can see them. Got them?
Yes, there we go. There we go.
Sure, we've got them. Okay, I'll just go to slide share.
Wonderful. That was great. Thanks.
there you go, because you need to see Pandora, the beautiful and cunning Pandora. She opens the jar. Of course she does. She probably opens it within seconds, and all the evils in the world fly out: famine, pestilence, vice, and a whole lot. And she's shocked because there's no hiding from this. They're out. They're gone in the world. And she slams the lid of the box down, and she saves one, and it's hope. And that's where our story begins, because why is hope in that jar anyway, with all the evils? What does it mean that it didn't fly out into the world where it might do some good potentially? And is it trapped? Is it imprisoned? Is it protected? And that's where we're going to pick up on hope. And we're going to pick up really using a whole lot of commentators, academics, theorists, philosophers, and contemporary examples. This comes from Donna Haraway in an article about her, where she talks about the vulnerability of concepts. And we're going to pick up on hope as a vulnerable concept. If it's in the jar in the first place, potentially it is bad, so to speak. But of course, the overwhelming sense of hope is it's vital, it's important. So how can it be at both ends of the spectrum? How can we render it benign? How can we even render it problematic? And why do we believe in it so much? Directly from Donna Haraway, she says, stay with the trouble of concepts. So we're going to stay with a troubled notion of hope that comes from Pandora's box. But she also says, make trouble with concepts, and make trouble in a good way. Make trouble, make them count, make them matter, make them make a difference. This comes from research that I'm doing across two projects, and I wanted to give the names of my colleagues. One is on hope itself and from a sustainability lens, and one is, and that's with my partners from the uni across the road, Mario and Peter from AUT, and one is on responsibility, and that's also using sustainability leaders with my colleagues, Rhiannon, Lainey, and supported by Laura. This is empirical work that is not in this presentation, but there are traces, there are voices. We've been following their voices, and a lot of it comes from that. Goes without saying, the interpretation, any problem in the ideas and the thinking and the stringing together are mine. Any credit for the potential of any of this is ours. We've gone to sustainability as perhaps potentially the hardest place to sustain hope. Grace talked of that earlier on, that the evidence is accumulating. We are reaching a tipping point. It may be not the tipping point of no return, but it might be. But it is the tipping point where we know we are not reaching the targets we've set ourselves. We are not looking like we will, and it's non-negotiable. We can all see that. Of course, the sustainability people know that perfectly well. And the sustainability managers that we interviewed know that perfectly well as well. So there is a failure, in a sense, to address what we need to address here. And there's a failure about who we need to be to address it, which makes looking at this group in terms of hope really, really interesting. Partly because it's not that they don't have it. It's not that we're killing off hope, but hope is in trouble in this world. Let's jump into a contemporary metaphor that you will know really well. And I know we will go to that. And that's Zizek's metaphor of us being in a tunnel. And we are living in this tunnel, probably not because we want to, but because we are reasonably reassured that the light at the end of it is a future, is a chance that we will overcome this thing, that we will be all right. And that means we can coexist in here. We can even operate to some extent. He says we have to face up to the courage that actually it's not the light at the tunnel, it's a train coming, and it's coming from the opposite direction. And we are not paying attention. And even if we were looking that way, we would be looking and misrepresenting it as the light at the end of the tunnel. He argues that when we think there is an alternative, and by alternative, I'm assuming an alternative to noticing the train that is coming the other way. We stop moving to end our predicament in the fullest, most complete way possible. He calls this requiring a courage, and the courage is not of hope, the courage is of hopelessness. We, in other words, need to give up the hope at the end of the tunnel and embrace, in a sense, the hopelessness of a train that is poised to enter the tunnel. How are we going to do that? If we go to Glasgow, nearer to you than to me from New Zealand, there was a lot of light at the end of the tunnel leadership. These are but two examples from, of course, very eminent and admired thinkers. From Attenborough, we are, after all, the greatest problem solvers to ever existed on Earth. If working apart, we are a force power enough to destabilize our planet. Surely working together, we are powerful enough to save it. From Obama, if we work hard enough for long enough, those partial victories add up. If we push hard enough, stay focused enough, and are smart about it, these victories accelerate and they build momentum. I'm not mocking the light at the end of the tunnel leadership statements, and I'm not being cynical about them, but they're not enough. Of course, when we think of Glasgow, we probably think of Greta's statement, already mentioned tonight, blah, blah, blah. Change is not going to come from inside there. That's not leadership. This is leadership. We say no more blah, blah, blah. That was picked up and reverberated around the world, and now Glasgow is a bit synonymous with the blah, blah, blah phrase, which Andrea uses. And even, of course, right at the top of our UN, we are digging our own graves. Let's call that the train is coming leadership. I'm not advocating the train is coming leadership as opposed to the light is at the end of the tunnel leadership. I'm saying they are both alive and well, they are both flourishing, they are both competing. Where we pick up our story of hope, though, and again we go to Greta, is we need to do something different about hope. We can't let people in power decide what hope is. This would pick up the democratization theme that Grace has brought up. Hope is not passive. Hope is not purely discursive. Hope is not blah, blah, blah. Hope is intrinsically related to this thing called. What are we going to do with that? If we go to Derek Jensen, who is an eco-philosopher and a somewhat controversial figure and a radical environmentalist, he makes the point that hope keeps us chained to a system. And that system, of course, is a conglomerate of people, ideas, and ideals that is causing not just the destruction of the earth, but behind a number of things. Zizek, of course, calls that post-capitalism. He argues that quitting or leaving hope makes you dangerous, and that danger is a good thing. And we're going to pick up this notion of being able to trouble hope and leave the hope in the box that is safe and protected as dangerous. Being dangerous, what does that look like? Well, Greta got to get a lot of it. Here's Trump. Greta must work on an anger management problem, then go to a good old-fashioned movie with a friend. Here's another one of the UK's, what would we call them, icons. I simply don't get the Thunberg phenomenon. She's no knowledge of how the world works, no manners, no letters after her name, because instead of going to school, she's been busy sailing around the world so she can be mardy and abusive to grown-ups. I had to look up mardy to check if it is a word, but it is definitely what he said. And of course, we can't go anywhere without Piers Morgan. She's very young and she seems over-emotional. So other people know what dangerous looks like, and others react to what dangerous looks like. And there's something Piers, Jeremy, and Donald Trump all have in common, and they are white men. In media, I'm not going to say in power politics, in media, it may interest you to know that Jeremy also said that Greta killed the car show, which seemed too damning to write down. So there is being dangerous. So I'm going to offer these as 3 tests for what are we going to do with hope. One is Pandora's box. Hope is locked in a box. We don't know why it was there in the first place and what it means that it's locked in the box. But we are going to play with it as something able to trouble more than it would do if it kept in the box. We've got the light at the end of the tunnel leadership, and we've got the incoming light of a train dilemma. And we've got this notion that if we do more with hope than currently is done, it can be dangerous in a good way. Overall, I picked up this question, which I thought was lovely. Can hope be the grounds for a politics that can respond to life in capitalist ruins? If we do enough with hope, if we can challenge it through our 3 tests, can it pick up from this post-capitalism or not perhaps end point, but problematic point where we are today? If you looked at the leadership research, you would say absolutely no, because it's very rarely, to be honest, even looked at. And wherein it is assumed to be unproblematically positive. Few would argue that leaders are purveyors of hope. Begins the only article I've actually found that looks at hope as the prime focus. And of course, the hope has become entrenched in the positive psychology field, where it's a force multiplier through history and where the leader's ability to generate hope is a given. It's measured, it is not argued. Hope also, in a more sociologically sense, has been looked at in other disciplines as fueling neoliberalism. That is a source of passivity, as a way of parking or sublimating much of what we need to do and who we want to be, to enable essentially business as usual for a neoliberal South End society. So we're going to have to take it in a different direction. These are just really placeholders for where we're going to go with it. We're going to try and look at a post-hope leadership, hoping you don't mind another post in front of something. We're going to look at leadership as needing to be entangled, embedded, embodied, material, and concrete. That it's got to stop being abstract, it's got to stop being singular, it's got to stop being individual, and this again picks up on Grace theme, that it is entangled and shared and joined up between people, between non-human, of course, agents within and with the world. We're going to argue that there is a temporality challenge to leadership that hope particularly shines a light on, that it has to be attentive to a very, very fine line between a speculative and often abstract future and a troubled present that doesn't offer easy ways of maneuvering. We're not getting rid of futurism, which some want to do, but we're going to say the relationship between the present and future is really, really central. And finally, we're going to argue that that responsibility is directly linked to hope, but it's a different form of responsibility. It's a co-responsibility, a collective responsibility, and exists within relational, collective, communicational, and discursive processes. Who are we going to look at to help us do this? We're going to look at Donna Haraway, and this is her fuller version of Staying with the Trouble, which is really like the last part of that it involves seeing us as mortal critters entwined in myriad unfinished configurations of places, times, matters, and meanings. I think Owen brought that in the question aspect of the last half hour, that we need to be within the world, getting our hands dirty, and an essential and non-negotiable part of it, and not in a past we don't claim responsibility for, or an apocalyptic or salvic future that we can't connect to or make happen. The temporality, and I've put these quotes together because they're quite different in the sense and their phrasing, but they get to the same place. And one is the famous one from Freire: what can we do today in order to be able to do tomorrow what we are unable to do today? Which again, of course, plays on the present to the future. This is Donna Haraway in an interview in The Guardian, open up the sense of what might yet be that which is not yet possible. And there is a sense of leadership as being anchored to possibility and anchored to play that comes through in both of these, that there is a political imagination that we need to realise that is not constrained by who we have managed to be so far, and a failure to see who we need to be in the future. There's a redefinition of hope. And this actually is a funny redefinition because it's actually an archaic meaning of hope. And hope used to mean, or has meant, or can mean, where trust can be placed. And it seemed to me that that's worth resurrecting, because where trust can be placed is highly problematic in a world where we recognise different truths, where it's not just our interpretations are different, but it's very much our even acknowledgement of so-called fact is essentially different. And we need to redefine responsibility in terms of where trust can be placed, because trust will only be placed where we can be responsible in a new way. How are we going to be responsibility in a new way? All of us are going to have to accept responsibility. This comes from Jung's social connection theory, where she redefines responsibility away from liability or fault through to possibility and the future. And anyone who is implicated, contributing, or affected by a structural process, and particularly those, of course, that cause injustice in the wider sense of the word, have responsibility. Responsibility, in other words, is not conferred through position, through rank, through letters after the name. It's through involvement. It's through participation. This responsibility is both ethical and political, but most of all, it is connected, it is relational, and it is in solidarity with others. And that means you can't be responsible as an individual. We are responsible together. And finally, we are all responsible to and for, but we are not all responsible in the same ways. And I think that's a blueprint for thinking through what it means to be responsible when we're not in the old sense of responsible, in the sense of causation, in the sense of having the sole ability to make decisions, in the sense of accountability. Responsibility spelled both ways is a very different thing. This doesn't just, of course, apply to the environment. Shizek has 5 calls that need a different look at hope versus hopelessness. One is fundamentalism and terrorism. One is geopolitical tensions. He's essentially, I think, thinking of the big players here: China, Russia, America. One is new emancipatory movements, and he's essentially thinking of a myriad of them in Europe. One is people flows, and particularly, of course, refugees, but also the far more general flow of people who need to leave places that cannot sustain them, and where they will go, and the incident of birth, which means we are born to either one of those, and there is no passage between them for many. And finally, of course, and it's been mentioned today, populism. So let's go back to our 3 tests, and let's rethink our tests for hope. If we go back to Pandora's box, of course, there is another meaning of the word hope that got left in the box, and that apparently is close to the Greek for expectation. So if hope meets the type of hope that is an expectation, the type of hope that is easy to expect, and because it's easy, doesn't require much action, then that hope is not useful, and it may as well be left in the box. If leadership has primarily left hope in the box and not had a good look at it, and has not troubled it and made it trouble. So can our new version of hope that is embedded in concrete practice, that is dangerous, that is systemic, that leads to a different sort of responsibility, can it be a form of hope that can, I'm not sure it's meant to fly out into the world and combat the evils, or whether it's meant to stay close to us and be a negotiation, be a mediation, be a construction that we can use. In terms of the light at the end of the tunnel and the light of an incoming train, it seems to me that one is the present and one is the future. And at the very least, a tunnel opens out onto both. And can we make the present matter, but in ways that only craft a future that is beyond the possibility of today? Can we play in a sense? Can possibility be the connection between the light at the end of the tunnel and the train coming in? And finally, can hope actually be dangerous? Could we reach a phase in terms of our leadership studies where hope is a galvanizing, catalyzing, slightly unpredictable and very much surprising entity to work with? That partly comes from the subjects, the participants we're working with in our empirical work, where some are using hope, some are comfortable with the old form of hope, but many are finding ways to rethink hope, redefine hope, rework hope, and even substitute, in a sense, the energy of hope with other things, and often in very concrete ways that we have talked to. So the antecedents of this are happening in the world. Just going to escape from here. Oh, am I there? Daniel, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you. You can just see your PowerPoint slide, the final one that says thank you.
Oh, okay, that's very helpful, which means I can let it go. Excellent.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so that is a deep dive into a water that we have largely been swimming in and not looking at as leadership scholars. It's a bit of a mishmash, pastiche, bricolage of various elements coming together. It's open-ended in the sense of it's an invitation to offer something that will add to our understanding of something that's been in a box. And I can't use the word hope, I realize, because we are looking at hope. It's a play with a defining essentialist aspect of leadership, and a stretch, a pull into can we do something with it that actually offers something to work with in an area that is arguably the most difficult to work with, which is our challenge with the environment.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Bridget. Yeah, massive amount of information there, and really interesting directions to take, I think, a challenge to leadership in particular. For participants, do get your questions in using the Q&A box, and we'll put those to Bridget. I'll kick things off, I guess, as Owain did, with a bit of chair's privilege. One of the things that I'm often very interested in is how we can translate some of these conceptual things into practice. And you touched just there at the end, Bridget, on the empirical work that you've been doing and how some people are beginning to use that word, play with ideas of hope in their practice. So I was wondering if you could maybe give us a bit more about that, if you felt comfortable doing so.
I would, yes, and that's of course the bit that is very much in present. But a number of people caught our eye, and I should say that the group as a whole is all over the place in terms of hope, and so there's a huge spectrum. One of the first people we did that has given away hope in the sense of the version in the box has substituted joy and love. And that really caught my attention because that, in a sense, was moving from an abstraction to something visceral, something felt, something real. And it was, as she described it, liberating. Because when you have joy in something or when you love something, there is no, in a sense, obstacle to moving into action, to trying to reach perhaps beyond where you might have got to otherwise. And so what she sent a message of that has been picked up in a number is that we often use hope and leadership as an energy. We often see it as an energy that we offer to others or an energy that we find ourselves. And she raised that energy can come from a different place. And when it does, it can be a very real place in terms of that. So there's quite a lot different from working towards a future you're trying to conceptualize to making something you love manifest, making it material. The other thing that a number of people were doing was we're experimenting with movement and engaging how to move in a world where all the information, all the evidence, all the science, and these are sustainability leaders, so they read this stuff, hey? They know all of this, but how to get movement in a way that didn't base off the science, but acknowledged the science, honored the science, and recognized the science, but also understood there is a space beyond silence. Science, not silence, and that space is that space of play, place of possibility, that place of imagination, that place of in a sense, collective construction and how to get there. Others were denying the hope in a rational way, but using it in a leadership way. So it became a tool, I suppose, for working with others, but also in a space where themselves had gone beyond. And that was a more troubled place, using something that you have essentially started to free yourself from. I don't know if any of that answers your question, eh?
No, I think the main thing there is how it is you've mentioned all the way through it is a place of it's complex, it's relational, discursive, etc. And that I think that really comes through. I suppose a follow-up, because you mentioned several times, you mentioned it in your talk in the context of political imagination, but the concept of imagination and how that fits with this, because when you were talking about joy or love, for example, they're obviously equally terms that could be interpreted in the same way that we've interpreted hope in this example. So how does imagination link, and is imagination the tool to reimagine hope, or is it itself problematic and caught up in that same thing?
It's a really interesting one. And I can give an example from my own country, though it's an example I think you can use other words for political imagination. But one of our big rivers in the North Island has been given the status of an ancestor. And of course, a lot of what I'm speaking of, our kaupapa Maori or Indigenous scholars go to immediately because they've always known it. And if you think about it, if your river is your ancestor, then or a relative even, we don't even have to go to ancestor because the river is here now, it's living, then you treat the river really differently, don't you? You care for the river, you protect the river. If the river's in trouble, you go and engage with the river. You think about who you want the river to be in the future. You think about who the river has been. You form a network around the river. You look through at who will pick up your responsibility with the river. And it seems to me from a Pākehā or a Western perspective that if the mountains are our friends, if the rivers are our ancestors, if the trees are our cousins, if the world is essentially our family or our whānau, as we call it in New Zealand, then in a sense that almost gets us there, doesn't it? We know how to treat family, friends, whānau. We know what is important. We have principles, we have values. And Donna Haraway speaks of this as well in the sense of making kin. And making kin essentially means kinship with non-human phenomena. And the world, this river is our kin. And to me, from a non-Indigenous perspective, that's an amazing act of political imagination because it changes everything. I am kin to a river, and the river is actually, I'm not where the river is, but the river is now supplying a lot of the water for this big city I live in. And that actually means, in terms of this new social connection theory of responsibility, which is you're responsible if you're involved or impacted or linked in some way, I am now linked to the health and well-being of that river. And it's aspects like that, I think, that break through the obstacles, that break through the barriers, that break through the limits of particularly when we remove human and world, when they are different entities, when we say, one has priority over the other. The river and I have now a sort of intertwined destiny. And to me, that's a massive act of political imagination. Does that help, that example?
I think, well, just for me, I'll let other people chip in on the Q&A if they have any follow-ups, but it also obviously it creates a different sort of perspective or lens to look at the notions of sort of community organizing that Grace was mentioning earlier as well. So I think it's an interesting issue for that. We have a few questions already in, so I'll move to those. And the first one's from Nathan Harter. I'm going to show my own ignorance here because I'm not aware of the writer, but it's Badgerho. Are you, Bridget? Is that familiar with that? Anyway,
sorry?
The writer in the question from Nathan. Anyway, I'll read it out. So they wrote that during any crisis, the first step is to stop the panic, and then only then can you address the crisis. So the question is, am I correct that the message of this keynote is contrary to that? That the global panic should be sharpened, made more accurate, embraced as the only realistic portal toward a better world. So interesting question from Nathan.
It's a really interesting question, and it's a really interesting question about crisis as well, which is yes, you stop the panic, you do what needs to be done, you address the immediate concerns. But there's a second part of the crisis, and I guess I'm thinking of Heifetz's leadership in a permanent crisis piece, which I actually do like. And he says there's an emergency phase of a crisis where you do what needs to be done immediately, and that is generally around buying time and protecting lives. So you have to do that. But there's also a concurrent, and so we shouldn't call it a second phase, a concurrent stream of work, which is the adaptive phase, which is addressing and engaging with the root causes of the crisis, but also the possibilities of the crisis. And we are meant to move between emergency and adaptive phases of the crisis. So I do accept that there is a need to stop the panic. If panic, of course, means people can't think and can't exist in a safe, secure way. But I don't accept that's all what you do in a crisis. And Heifetz's point really is that crisis, maybe sadly and maybe unfortunately, is often the episodes of our lives where the biggest change is possible. And we've seen that with COVID, and we've seen that as a group of university scholars, haven't we? In New Zealand, we were given, or in Auckland, we were given 1 week to go online. I had never taught on Zoom. I had my Zoom practice was kind of minimal. It consisted of answering an invitation and appearing on screen. And within 1 week, we were suddenly teaching classes, engaging with students, and we all did it. And that's a tiny example. There's been so much more. So crises are often the place where we can glimpse possibility most. If we'd had a vote the week before we had to do it about whether online teaching was possible and how long it would take, we would have said it was years away. But actually it was 1 week, but a crisis made that possible. So that would be my argument, which is, yes, there's emergency work with a crisis, but there's also adaptive work with a crisis. Given that our world, and this is Heifetz's title, is that crisis is more or less permanent, I don't think we can exist in the emergency phase for forever. I don't think we can stop there, and I think we are with much crises. Does that help that question?
I'll answer on Nathan's behalf, and Nathan, feel free to ask a follow-up if you'd like to. But yeah, thanks very much for that. And I think that's a very good example you use as well for answering the question of COVID and moving online and etc. So let's move on to a question from Paul Poder, who asks, can one sum up one basic point of your talk as suggesting that hope is a category we should always try to engage specifically, concretely? Whenever we talk about hope, we should investigate the question, what can we actually hope for in given situations and what not? So I guess, is that the question we should constantly ask?
Yeah, though that's, and I might be misreading, it's Paul, isn't it? I might be misreading that to some extent, but it seems to me what can we actually hope for and what not is not particularly concrete. You know, that in a sense is quite abstract, and it's a question of what, not how. I think the concrete is actually a question of how, and it's a question of action. And of course, agrees only a number of people who said stop using words. Let's see the action. So the concrete I'm thinking of, and it may be the wrong word, and I don't normally use concrete, and I borrowed it from others who used it, but it really means using our bodies, being in the midst of others and the world, and acting our way towards a solution, as opposed to thinking our way towards a solution. It's not being detached. It's not being cognitive. It's bringing our emotional, embodied, I suppose, knowledge and practice. Above all, though, it's a mindset shift, which is we are of the world. We are as material as anything else in the world. We act on the world, and humans have a propensity to try and think with our heads as if we are giant heads who think. So it's more that sense of concrete that I meant, rather than that sounds quite a rational way of what can we hope for. I don't know what we can hope for or not, and it sounds too rational a question, I think. But I think I can see, and my big challenge is giving up the car. I live in a car city. I have been to places, and Copenhagen, I know some people are here, is one, where they have worked out a whole lot of ways of living without owning a car. We in New Zealand haven't. I can think all you like about cars. I can try and project when New Zealand will be less reliant on cars. But really, I have to give up my car, don't I? And I have to work out a way of doing it sooner rather than later. And whether that's a bicycle or New Zealand public transport's not as evolved as other parts of the world, whether that's walking, which I love, that's the kind of visceral work I need to do, which is not get in my car and get to uni some other way. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. And it's an interesting, I'll reflect back to the earlier discussion about how the role of individualism and how, this has to be relational, and obviously the concept of giving up the car is a bit like was mentioned about stop using plastic straws, and how it can be approached very much as an individual decision, but actually, as you mentioned earlier in one of your responses, talking about the river and how it does involve both human, non-human actors, etc. It is a bigger question, but the main emphasis being that action, I think ties in nicely, because obviously Grace was talking about that need for democratic engagement and action, and
Yes.
in order to move forward.
Okay. And our universities need to do it too. So I was talking with someone, we're setting up a big sustainability centre in our university, and we're setting up a whole sustainability curriculum. And I was talking to someone in that, and they was talking about how they couldn't wait to get back to conferences overseas. And I'm exactly the same. I'd so love to be there, and I can't be. But we can't jump on a plane, can we, anymore, as lightly as we did for a half-hour conference on the other side of the world, which in New Zealand is a 30-hour trip. We just can't do that, eh? And it seems to me that that's again this notion of getting stuck in, realizing in a sense there's an emotional connection to wanting to be in an academic community and wanting to travel, and yet there's an obvious cost that, and her response was, well, let's go plant trees whenever we travel. That's not going to get us to these targets, eh? And to me, the distance of being in a plane, in a sense, is this, and to go to some place on the other side of the world for something that perhaps we can do other ways, even though I miss it. That again is another concrete example. And we're all going to have to do that one, because our universities are here a huge source, aren't they, of plane travel and all sorts of things. You guys can jump on a train and get there. We can't. So it's a bigger question in a sense for us.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for that. I noticed Owain has his hand raised, so I'll bring you in, Owain, if you've got a question or contribution.
I'm really enjoying this, Bridget. It's fantastic. It was just a technical thing, because I was engaging with a question and comments from Keith Grint, and I pressed the button, and then it flicked over to the category called answered immediately, and it's disappeared from the open. So I've managed to censor Keith Grint. Not deliberately, but sometimes I wish I could.
Yeah, thanks, Owain. I did notice that I'd moved over. So yes, it is in the answered one, but Keith, I'll read out Keith's question. So Keith says, James Stockdale survived many years in a Vietnamese prisoner of war camp and differentiated between optimism and hope. Optimists were those who thought they would be released in a few months. They never were, and some didn't survive. Those that survived were those who hoped they would eventually be free, but recognized the brutal reality facing them that meant it would be years, not weeks. Does this dual meaning relate to why hope was in Pandora's box?
That it was in the box, whereas optimism was let go out of the box to be fairly futile. Is that Keith always has complete. I'm trying to find it in the thing so I can reread it. Keith always has completely fabulous little stories.
Yes, if you're in the Q&A box at the top, you should see open and then answered and dismissed. If you click on the answered tab,
open,
it's in there.
Yeah.
I'll just read out Owain's response while you're pondering and rereading.
You read Owain's response.
Yeah, it was to say that super interesting, Keith, and to mention that Terry Eagleton made similar points in his Hope Without Optimism, to be blindingly optimistic and to breed Prozac positivity, which is a concept in leadership from David Collinson, I think.
Yes.
In leadership is surely unethical. Eagleton says hope is about cultivating the possibility of contingency, and I think about that often. I know there must be more to it than that, but maybe a lot of today's passivity and fatalism centers on people not believing that there can be an otherwise. I wonder if Bridget has any thoughts on these themes. There you go, perfect segue back.
Well, I think that there's a huge difference between optimism and hope, and I too looked at Prozac leadership, thinking it might have something to say about hope. So we're sort of saying optimism is is a lesser and lighter, perhaps, version of hope, but a more passive one, and even hope is passive. The sustainability literatures, and I'm not an expert on these, my colleagues have done a whole lot of categorizing of different kinds of hope and optimism, and there is false hope and considered hope and constrained hope, and there are all sorts of categories of optimism as well. And I can see that they are trying to complexify a terrain in order to work with it. There is something about all this categorization and scales and gradients of hope and hope-like adjectives that I feel doesn't solve the picture to some extent. And that if we can peel away optimism and protect hope, I'm not sure we are more along with it. I think there is work to do with hope. I think the confusion between hope and optimism isn't helpful. And so I think that is important work to do. I'm also not about destroying hope. And I'm really, really clear. This is not about bury the box and with hope in it and not let it come out. It's about doing more with hope, in the sense that that there is a potential in hope that we haven't realized, and that is the potential of it being more dangerous. And maybe it's that hope often seems benign, maybe it goes benign because it's flavored with optimism, but there is also a cusp where hope begins to look more dangerous in the hands of others. One of the reasons I went to Derek Jensen and Greta and looked at hope is that they seem a bit ahead of the academic literature in many ways. They are more radical than we are around hope as leadership scholars, and that really did bother me, which is, what is it we're missing? Why are we behind? Why are those who are actually on the front lines, and I know many of us are, but why are they already beginning to abandon and move? And this imperial group we're looking at, many of them are in that category too. And yet it's not reflected in our research, and I'm wondering why.
Yes, and it's sort of, as you mentioned, it's doing more with hope, isn't it? Rather than treating it as a light concept, to actually treat it as something that can have serious implications and discussions and change. It's maybe applying hope as a concept to itself, perhaps, and figuring out what that might mean. Yeah. Great, thanks for that, and great question there, Keith. There's a question as well from Frank Meyer from CBS, which says, "Thank you, Bridget, for this exciting expose. Is it fair to say that currently the strongest hope-producing machine is technological capitalism, and with it the idea that the path to sustainability is at its core technological?" Good question. Are there stronger machines for hope production than this?
And yeah, that's a killer question, and I'll take it off. But it's also funny, Owain, in your territory, I believe, than mine. So technological capitalism, I'm only a reader of it. Hope in machines, hope in artificial intelligence, hope in I suppose the hope I would see there, and I may be really naive and simple in this, because there are far greater minds on this than me, is in that machine-human interaction, in the space in between them. Not in the machines so much. And I know, of course, technological capitalism is about that, and the relationship we have with the non-human or the beyond human. Is there hope in there? Yes, there would have to be, but I would bring to it that same notion of the political imagination there. What becomes possible? And there is a definition of hope as I'm trying to remember whose it is, the possibility of possibilities. So yes, if that's what technology can mean, then I would think there is. Technology, though, can often mean other things as well. And we can see that even with the internet and so on, where it could open up possibility, often it opens up other things as well. So if it is an answer here, it's again a greatly complex one, but it's good to bring in the room.
Yes, absolutely. And we are often, well, again, as Grace sort of hinted at earlier on, very much in this Silicon Valley world that tells us that obviously that's the solution, which I think perhaps is the origin of some of that question. But very interesting, to think about actually what that opens up, as you mentioned there, Bridget, and the alternatives within that same context.
It could be used as another light at the end of the tunnel rationale that technology will save us. And I think you'd have to be really distrustful that anything that is not us and us rethinking who we are and how we are together and how we need to move is not an answer at all. And technology is not an answer without us doing that work. But together, maybe it does create a whole new horizon of possibility.
Okay, great. We have probably about five minutes left, I guess. I've not seen any more questions, but if anyone's got any, feel free to add them in the Q&A. But I guess I'll sort of, Bridget, give you an opportunity if you want to close with some final thoughts before we wrap up this session.
Oh, just some final thoughts, because I actually never got to it, which is this notion of rebooting and restarting, because that in a sense is the technological language, isn't it, of doing this? And it struck me because a lot of my talk and the people I was reading was straining far more to the organic imagery and being entangled in the natural world in organic ways. And my river example was exactly that as well. But the notion of rebooting and restarting is very non-organic, and it is very, what would be the word? It's, I suppose, very, very decisive. Those are actions that you purposefully do, and they're also instant. So you reboot. Well, I reboot something by switching it off, and I reset something by turning it on. And I was interested in the conference, and because I think it's a fabulous theme that the rebooting, resetting might have not got the bit in the middle, because you can't switch things off and you can't pull a switch to switch things on. But they're nonetheless very powerful metaphors. And I suppose my final thought would be, and this is for the conference, what comes in between rebooting and resetting? What is that space in between? And I'd be really interested in that.
That's an excellent question. We'll hopefully have the answer for you on Tuesday evening, I guess.
Tuesday evening. Oh, that's good to have that answer.
Oh yeah,
I'll
task Owain with summarising the answer to that when we get there. Okay, so we're coming up to the end of the session. So it remains for me to say a massive thank you to Brigid, Professor Carroll for that contribution, and also to Grace earlier on. We now have a break before the next session. All the details can be found on the website for the program that's on the website for the conference. So this session will end, and we'll reconvene at 8 o'clock GMT, UK time, for our paper session, which will be chaired again by Owain. And we've got several really interesting papers coming up there. I'll just give a brief overview. So rebooting service providers collaboration with the leadership of hard to reach minority ethnic groups. And that's with colleagues from the European University, Fidel Mukhtar-Sibo, Steve Vangen, who we heard from earlier, and Carol Jackman-Jarvis. The moderating role of leadership on the association between the use of information systems and organizational performance. That's Sandy Arif from Macquarie University. Collective leadership and the Queensland Indigenous Labour Network from Michelle M. Evans from the University of Melbourne. And then finally, Reserved Voices, American Indian Leadership in Education. That's from Linda Sue Warner and G. Stanley Briscoe III from Northeastern Oklahoma A&M College and Pawnee Nation College, respectively. So we'll end the first keynote session here, and hope to see as many of you as possible. You're all very welcome to the next session, which will start, as I mentioned, at 8 o'clock GMT. Thanks very much.